So, what are the United States and the risk of a nuclear disaster in Iran up to again? Trump ordered a conditional 5-day delay of attacks on Iranian power plants. Yes, Donald Trump says that Iran is negotiating about it. Iran denies it. We don't really want to deal with this today. We'd rather discuss what an attack on Iranian power plants would mean because Iran also has nuclear power plants. And many of you have asked how big the risk is of a nuclear disaster on the level of Chernobyl or Fukushima, specifically in Iran. And I'll try to answer that today. Let me say up front that I'm not an expert on nuclear power plants or nuclear safety and these things, so my expertise is purely based on using Google, artificial intelligence, Wikipedia, and knowledge of history, but we'll try to summarize it here somehow. First of all, it's important to say that an attack on a nuclear power plant is a brutal war crime, and the United States would probably not resort to that. I'm not saying that the United States doesn't mind or does mind committing war crimes, obviously not, but there are war crimes that even the United States cannot tolerate, if I put it that way. And an attack on a nuclear power plant with the direct aim of destroying it would be quite serious. What is a bit different, for example, is an attack on a uranium enrichment facility. A uranium enrichment facility is not exactly a nuclear power plant. If you send some bombs there, of course, there could be some radiation leakage, since they do work with uranium there, but the reaction itself doesn't take place there. That means the worst thing that can happen there is that the explosion simply scatters the uranium around the area. You hit some container of radioactive steam or something like that. It leaks out, contaminates the immediate surroundings, gets into the air, disperses, but it won't be a disaster on the level of Chernobyl. It won't even be a fraction of what happened at Chernobyl. Precisely because in such a facility there is no fission reaction, and therefore the uranium in the container is not actually being activated. That means that such a facility can, of course, cause some local contamination, but only in a very limited area. However, it's definitely not even remotely comparable to the Chernobyl or Fukushima accidents. So that's the first point. This is not a risk at a level that, for example, the entire Middle East should be worried about. Or, for example, Southeastern Europe or Iran or Asia and so on, that it would threaten large areas. This is strictly a radiation risk for the base, where the uranium simply disperses, where the vapor escapes, and so on. As for the nuclear power plant, it hasn't been under attack yet, but there have already been projectiles falling in the area of the nuclear power plant. And now let's say, okay, what if the Americans lost their minds? After all, they're led by Donald Trump. What if they lost their minds and started, in the name of covering up the Epstein files and a holy war or something like that, when we see Pete Hexet's tattoos, they started bombing that Iranian nuclear facility? Could that cause a Chernobyl-level disaster? Well, first of all, I would say it's important to compare those two reactors, those two power plants. But let's start by summarizing and reviewing a bit what caused the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. It's important to say here that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a different, more outdated, and worse type of reactor than the one in the Iranian nuclear power plant. The problem at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was that when the water there started to evaporate and turn into steam, the fission process actually became faster and faster. And they were conducting a, let's say, risky test there to see how things would behave during a power outage, how the turbine would work during a power outage, and so on. Simply put, they messed it up and were heading all along toward making the accident as big as possible. It was actually a combination of poor reactor design, human error, and risky behavior. That's why there was such a massive explosion, such a massive release of energy, a graphite fire, and so on. And then, of course, the contamination of the entire area, the release of a huge amount of radioactive material into the atmosphere, its subsequent spread to the surroundings, blowing over to Europe. You know the story. And that was caused by the fact that they were basically heading toward disaster the whole time, combined with a type of reactor that is no longer in use today. As I said, the Iranian nuclear power plant uses a different type of reactor where water has a different role and graphite has a different role than it did in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And besides that, there are also more levels of security. There's simply a containment structure, things like that. Therefore, the risk of the same kind of incident as in Chernobyl happening, even if there was some kind of bombing, is really minimal. However, what could happen and what really is a risk are these two scenarios. First, the loss of cooling for spent fuel due to the destruction of various pumps, power generators, basically significant damage to the cooling system for spent fuel. Of course, there is a pool on the premises, and in it there is about 200 tons of spent fuel. If the pool wasn't refilled, if it were emptied, it could lead to a fire of that radioactive fuel. As a result, some radioactive substances would be released, and that could contaminate the surrounding area. Similarly, there could be a problem with a core meltdown. Not an explosion like in Chernobyl, but a core meltdown could occur if, as a result of bombing, the power supply failed, and at the same time the backup generators failed, and there was no one there to actually interrupt the process, and the automatic shutdown of the process also failed. If a series of these failures were to combine, if no one interrupted the process, the generators failed, the electricity failed, basically everything went wrong, then a core meltdown could really occur, with some leakage into the groundwater and the surrounding area, and again it would lead to a Fukushima-type scenario, not a Chernobyl-type scenario. Still a disaster, still a nuclear accident, but not on the level of Chernobyl. In the same way, you might ask what would happen if a missile just flew straight into the reactor. First of all, the reactor is very heavily fortified, so the idea that some, let's say, stray missile could destroy the reactor is very unpleasant. It's unlikely. But if there were a targeted bombing with the aim of destroying the reactor using explosives, first of all, as we said, that would be a brutal war crime. Donald Trump basically wouldn't be able to leave the United States anymore because he would be arrested. That's the first point. Or at the very least, they should have arrested him. That's the first point. Well, the second point is that even if you hit the reactor with really heavy artillery, if you damaged it by hitting it with a missile, the core would melt down again. There could be some forms of leaks, but again, there wouldn't be an explosion, a graphite fire, or a large-scale leak like at Chernobyl. Yeah, the worst-case scenario here, even in the most pessimistic and craziest scenarios, is a Fukushima-like scenario. However, it's important to realize and calm down a bit that even the Fukushima scenario is exorbitant. It's extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely. The Americans have no intention of causing a nuclear accident. Why? Because it's completely unnecessary. If their, let's say, idea was to disconnect Iran from electricity, then it doesn't make sense to attack a power plant that produces about 10% of Iran's electricity, and at the same time to get rid of 10% of Iran's electricity produced by that nuclear power plant, but at the cost of Donald Trump becoming a war criminal. An absolute war criminal, and the United States would officially become a terrorist country. So it's not really worth it, and you can just bomb, even then it would be war crimes, but of the kind we're used to from the United States, it seems so, but you can just bomb those oil and coal power plants. Power plants, and especially gas power plants, which Iran relies on. Yeah, if you bomb these power plants, you can destroy 90% of Iran's ability to produce electricity, and everyone will just say civilians are suffering, but no one will be like, oh my God, you guys are complete lunatics. You just caused another Fukushima. You absolute idiots. This is the end, damn it. Sanctions, Trump's elite, damn it, expel the diplomats. This is a taboo that should never have been broken. Not even the Russians broke it. To hell with America, to hell with everyone. Yeah, so it's pointless, it's not worth it, they really have nothing to gain there, and of course, with such an attack, they have a lot to lose. And of course, your argument might be, but Donald Trump said he would attack the biggest power plant. Well, sure, he'll attack the biggest power plant, but, you know, Donald Trump. In my opinion, he doesn't even know. I don't think he even knows that Iran has a nuclear power plant. I think he just said it like, I'll attack the biggest one, as if the biggest one is the most important, because big things are big. Because big baga boom unga bunga Donald Trump, you know what I mean? The orange man talks a lot. I mean, I wouldn't really take him literally when we know what his cognitive ability is, which is zero, right? Therefore, it's necessary to look at it a bit soberly with some distance, take it with a grain of salt, and even if he was a complete lunatic, be aware that Chernobyl is not a threat. At worst, Fukushima, which isn't positive either, but it's better than Chernobyl. So that's about it. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this explanation has given you a bit of insight into the Chernobyl-Fukushima Iranian nuclear disasters, that maybe it calmed you down a bit if you were nervous about it, and that you might have picked up on some connections that might not have been clear to you until now. If so, great. Leave a comment, give a like, subscribe, share, and support this content financially through the QR code if you think it's good enough for your investment. Have a great day. See you for now, and don't panic about nuclear accidents.